Right, so I'm going to sort of shift the stage from China-centric to looking at two important neighboring regions in Asia. And I'm going to look at Central Asia as a potential player in terms of new models of development and talk about sometimes turning development on its head and looking at smaller countries who sometimes have better resolved problems than bigger countries. And accepting China as exceptional and possibly not a repeatable experiment for historical and other reasons, it's quite useful to look at other parts of the world and see where we can get in relation to that. So doing economic reform is an old story. It's 3 decades old. And as someone who's a comparativist and goes across Asian countries, it's interesting that the more you study different Asian countries, the more diverse the results seem to be, to the extent that all these countries are doing competitiveness, they're doing quality, they're doing FDI, but the relationships between them don't really fit into one pattern, except when you want to analyze the statistics and you kind of put them into columns, and sometimes the outliers are more interesting than those in the center. And so there's a conundrum in terms of whatever the orthodoxy, whether it's political science or development studies or economics, any of these orthodoxies, the idea of multiple is exciting, but it's messy. And you're not sure which way you're going. So, you know, is Uzbekistan a basket case? What should we do with Azerbaijani oil? Should they be resource curses? Should we think of them as possible growth? What do we do with the old categories of the 20th century? What's the post-Soviet inheritance? What are we transitioning from? What are we transitioning to? And I guess appropriate or inappropriate, the financial crisis makes us think about these things. So there is concern about whether linear is appropriate, whether we should think more creatively, and as many of the speakers have already spoken about this morning, the particularity of national institutions. So that's all out there to think about, but I'd like to sort of characterize it more formally by saying, if you look at the way in which, you know, you look at the literature on reform, we can talk about different scales of reform. So you start with the macroeconomic, you look at the microeconomic, and then you have this interesting set of reforms through the 1990s, the meso, the kind of Chilean experience. You start at the industry level, and then you can go up or down. So we've got some traction on what different countries are doing. What we still don't know is there still a one-size-fits-all? And then I asked this question in relation to work I've been doing in Central Asia now for a decade, and it's almost like there isn't a single transition economy. The more I look into these countries, the more I'm finding it difficult to say what the transition is. I mean, there's development, but where are they going to and for whom? And I think the for whom question probably is critical in terms of the focus of this forum in relation to inequality. Who's benefiting from the growth? Who's not benefiting from the growth? And what are the consequences if whether inequality is rising or not in terms of social policy? And if we look at some of the data from, you know, sources, every year we've had a flip-flop in the last 3 years. And if you look at 07, 09, you see that, you know, countries that did well in one sector didn't do so well in the second, but except for Asia, where I accept some of this data might be China, but I'd like to suggest that some of this data is actually Central Asia, a smaller scale, but an important block. And so we're still struggling to find a language. We're second generation, but if you think of second generation, which is looking at firms in countries, then we still have huge gaps in firms in terms of productivity. So you have some players, and China's a very useful case to start with, and even in the oil industry, which I will focus on a little bit further, in terms of players who've come up as sovereign wealth funds, which are, you know, the top 10 in the world. And Australia also has a history of sovereign wealth, and it's worth thinking about how you can have counter-cyclical policies. But can we still talk in the second generation of catching up? There are those who believe that it's too late to catch up. The second or third generation industries are also RANs. And so here are we looking at new models of success in terms of, as Reza said, another country with a 9% rate of growth, or are we going to look at different orders of success? And so I'd like to just say, well, the lens here is on Central Asia, and there are 3 foci, really, which are interesting. I mean, there's the market one, and then there's the whole issue of no institution, so we want change. And then the even more contentious one, what do you do with the human rights dimension? And so if I look at those countries, then again, the country that I'm particularly interested in is Uzbekistan, to the extreme left on that slide, because It's often been talked of, terrible country, they boil their political opponents, and yet it's got an 8% rate of growth. So there's an interesting issue of what do we want 21st century development to actually look like. And so I'd like to say that if we classify according to different types of transition, maybe it's not different alternatives, but different types of transition within the region, then though the macroeconomic is the one that is the easiest to have traction with because we have data, it's very interesting to see what these countries have gone for. And they've tended to go for this really interesting mix between the public and the private sector. There are more types of partnerships in Central Asia than we would otherwise imagine. The Kazakh government at the Astana Economic Forum 2 years ago identified 63 kinds of partnerships. Now you could say they're only a classification on a piece of paper, but the fact they're thinking about these issues is a very interesting one where we're thinking about what does it mean to be plural. And also they changed the space, the geographical space and the language of development, because they're talking much more about regional cooperation is going to create industrial competitiveness. And for a moment it takes you back to the Bretton Woods idea after the Second World War in terms of the European community. And there are these interesting languages now, whether they are simply smoke to cover much more nefarious practices is up to question, but I think it's worth just at a time where we are redressing what we want in terms of development for the 21st century worth thinking about. And I'd like to take a tack where I say, actually, there are multiple processes. I'm not sure what they're going to result in, but governments have very different leads in this area. And they're all talking about investment, but they are identifying different parts of the value chain. So the point that Jen made in terms of agriculture, there are now false constructions in these countries in terms of what Soviet development meant. And quite understandably, as happens in any sort of post-colonial transition experience, the previous masters are always the ones who, and coming out of India, it's always the British. In 65 years after independence, still the British were the reason for either India's lack of growth or other problems. So you have this kind of false identity in terms of Soviet development. But there are also Soviet gifts. And one of the things I want to talk about, which was also echoed in the first session, was the power of almost universal education. And the kind of advantages where you have less social inequality in terms of growth. And then other kinds of discussions about the sort of problem of commodity prices, sort of earlier resource curses, the white gold, the cotton problem in Uzbekistan, and the politics around this. And I'd like to just raise this in relation to the idea of, can development reduce poverty? Does that mean that we move from club goods to social goods? And that's something I'd like to get us to think about. So here's my agricultural idyll. That's Kazakhstan up there on the right-hand side. And of course, they have the ability to feed a large part of the world's population. They have a small population, 20 million people, huge amount of wheat, could grow. And then at the bottom, of course, you've got the sort of classic, the Soviet inheritance and the clay soil. This is, of course, the Russian steppe tractors going into clay soils in Uzbekistan and getting stuck. Similar story in China in the 60s. But this idea of, people out there being happy and picking cotton and issues around human rights. These are the kind of pictures that come out of the region. But what lies behind them? What lies behind them is this changing, the liberalization debates in India in comparison with those in Central Asia. I just want to talk about different parts. I mean, India and China are big players, and if you think, of course, China's way ahead of India, but even within the Indian context, starting with a much lower social base. And I think Martin presented a very important dimension about that. The reemergence of caste politics in India is an example of social divisions actually very strongly moving against the possibility of equity. And India's had major sort of achievements in the bottom half of the slide in terms of technology and structural adjustment and moves in the economic space. But there are huge lessons that could still be learned in relation to the social space. So liberalization brought to India a huge number of opportunities. Rajat Gupta is the bad and the good of global McKinsey, but presents one face of global India in terms of the diaspora going across the world and providing new growth potentials. And it's also, as Jennifer said, in terms of urban-rural, brought rural India into the frame. However, it has stretched the Indian political system. And this is something that's worth thinking about, because I'm going to compare it in a few minutes with the Central Asian story of clan politics, about the importance of elites. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying elites are good, but I'm saying they're necessary. They actually direct the process by which development takes place, and controlling them becomes the question for development. So in Indian politics, I mean, there are splinter groups. It's not that different being coalition politics in the UK, where I'm based, and looking at coalition politics in India. It's a messy business. And in Australia, you've had kind of changes in government. So we have the issue of the fragmentation of the political sphere. Liberalization brings different opportunities for different groups, and the scramble gets more intense. So if you look at India here, actually India is just above sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, these are old HDR figures, but the CIS countries are right up there with OECD countries. So if you think about, you know, where Central Asia is located and where India is, actually India is way below on the curve. And let's look at the same thing in terms of the work I'm doing on education. This is data for Central Asia. I'm sorry, it's really small, but right at the bottom there's TJK. TJK at the bottom there at about 0.94, gender parity and net enrollment of 90%. That is Tajikistan, which borders Afghanistan, so geopolitically really important. But like all the other countries, it had 100% enrollment and full parity in 1990. And so the lack of development also creates challenges. If you reduce educational levels, it's actually far worse. It's asymmetric. Getting people to school, getting a generation of kids to school in India has benefited. 90% of kids are now enrolled, not all of them complete. But losing education is a far worse loss. And so this is the argument about, if you like, absolute poverty. So absolute educational deprivation. Because these next generation of kids, and in Tajikistan, the consequences for gender parity explained very clearly. Age of marriage has fallen from 25 years to 16 years for girls. So you lose your educational opportunities, and for boys. The most horrific statistic in Tajikistan is the number of divorces under the age of 30. It compares with any, you know, advanced capitalist country or high. So you see kind of interesting conundrums, and this is why the concern not just about the interactions between inequality and growth, but this idea that we know what a development model looks like. And if I compare that with South Asia, of course, Afghanistan is right at the bottom, but not that different from Tajikistan in terms of shifting. So there's this other India that we now know about, this India of 2012. There's still persistent poverty. I'd like to see Martin's Narega response and how good it is, but as you rightly said, the divergences are huge across districts, even in the same state. And actually the schisms of the unequal starting point, the inequity, is emerging. So we've had gains. It's possible to have regional development, but let's just look at those who've benefited. There is a new club, a global club in India. So if you say, oh, India is this greatest so-called functioning democracy, it's not a democracy where the doors are open. Martin said, open a second door. I'd like just one door to open in India. Everybody who gets education actually can go and find a job, which is not possible. We have results showing that if you've got a Muslim boy and he finishes university, he'd have to have 2 degrees to compete equally with a Hindu boy with 1 degree. That's Abhijit Banerjee and other people's research. So it's interesting. So when we look at Central Asia, I don't think the route of the big countries in Asia is the route that they followed. They have other challenges, and the specificities of history are important, but the challenges are different among Central Asian countries. So they've got the big questions. Move towards the market. What prices are we going to use? But they've also got this very important domestic political economy of, do they want club goods or do they want public goods? And in that way, Central Asia is an interesting cusp on the Silk Route between India and China, but also which partners do they turn to? And it's interesting to note that they turn to China willy-nilly in terms of actually thinking about what they want to do in terms of growth. And so I think what's interesting about the region is that it's not all countries following the same model. If you look in terms of HDI, Kazakhstan's a middle-income country. Tajikistan's a low-income country. In some ways, they're very, very different. Why does that difference come? Well, interesting. All these countries have had growth, some of them better than others, and just look at the top, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. It's oil-related. Sorry? Somebody said something, but that could be, okay. So, at the top, if you look at countries which have oil and gas, the question here is, why did this happen? Did the natural resource curse model not work? Did something else happen? I'd like to suggest the Sovereign Wealth Fund is one of the big players in this region. It's worth thinking about seriously. So there are interesting linkages. Natural resources are the driver in Central Asia. And this is important because we have now seen the second decade of growth rather than actually collapsing, coming out of collapse, they've used natural resources in a way to diversify their economy. So it's interesting to me. We don't have the Dutch disease, and it does things which are non-economic. The biggest investment Kazakhstan's making at the moment is in its civil service reform. They're looking at new linkages. It's a big challenge. Do you want elite and clan politics, or do you want accountability and not corruption? These are all debates happening in countries that we don't regard as democratic, but not happening to the same extent in India, which is supposed to be democratic. So here's something to think about. And of course, they've moved away from dams to what you do with oil and gas. And this is interesting because this is, of course, the sovereign wealth funds debate from 2008. Azerbaijan's not even on this list. Azerbaijan is only discovered in the last 3 years as a big player. But, Australia sits in the middle of that. It's interesting to look at what sovereign wealth is doing. We haven't looked enough at it because we think sovereign wealth creates problems in terms of transparency. And in that sense, of course, China's way up in terms of its investment strategy to some of the countries in Central Asia. But in Central Asia, they're thinking now of moving from just keeping funds to actual investment. So my suggestion is the next 5 years, you're going to find the Kazakh players, the Azerbaijani players right in there in terms of European politics. It's not just Norway buying debt from China, it will be Central Asia buying debt from other countries. So there's going to be a shift. It's very clear that they want to diversify into the very areas that we talked about. They want to use this for agriculture. They want to buy high-value agriculture. They've already invested in new international universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard. They're all in there, providing their new universities in terms of investment. And so what we're seeing here is, if you like, a resource corridor, not a resource curse. Kazakhstan's the same size as India. That's not what people think about. You just think about the population. But that changes the nature of what natural resources can do in an economy. So I'm suggesting, if you like, that some of the things that we thought at the end of the 20th century, that state players and natural resources were going to create hugely unequal societies, we could be pleasantly surprised that some of this diversification actually has increased the possibility of education and science into these societies. And how it's happened, and why it's a challenge is this cartoon, which I find quite amusing, is we thought profit was a lot easier before countries abandoned socialism and started competing. It's an old cartoon, but it does make me think that sometimes we're barking up the wrong tree. We're saying, countries can't grow. But actually, the challenge of countries working the market is that they use different approaches to work that market. And this occurs, and I'll give just 3 examples. Urban-rural. Urban-rural is an interesting issue in Central Asia because they have a very spread out population. You've got some big cities, and then you've got large amounts of silk route, which is route without people. But therefore, they have land. And under that land, they have some of the biggest aquifers in terms of water and population. So you've got a region which doesn't just have pipelines over the ground, but also has the possibility of shifting. But those spaces are also geopolitically very important. Kazakhstan is the biggest provider to Afghanistan in terms of donor aid, particularly as the West pulls out. And I know for Australia, maybe Central Asia seems very, very far away, but you're all pretty much linked in terms of the struggle that's going on. And so there is an issue about how Central Asia needs to be viewed by the rest of the world, not just what they're doing in terms of challenges, but most interestingly, in terms of income and resources. The Gini coefficient is increasing in these regions, but it is not running across identities more unequally. I accept Gini coefficients are going up, but if you run it by communities, unlike Jennifer's example of the Uyghurs in China, we're not getting it across groups of people. So the point I'm making is you've got economic growth, but you've got a diversification strategy which is not dissimilar. And at the moment, the Kazakh oil company is talking to Khazanah, which is, of course, the major sovereign wealth fund in Malaysia, about talking about how you can use oil funds to reduce ethnic conflict. Really interesting if that country is providing donor aid to Afghanistan, the things that you could think about in terms of building politics. So I'm just going to end with saying we know development's multidimensional. I take Martin's point that multidimensional is difficult. But in some ways, it allows you to enter the growth trajectory using what you've got in terms of natural resources. I think Reza made that point very well, the difference between the philosophy of a country and the pragmatics in the country. And if there's something that I'll end with saying that most interesting to me, the thing is that BRICS have become crib. Everyone says it's going wrong. They're going to collapse, replace India by Indonesia. But I wouldn't worry too much of which countries are in the BRIC. I mean, I always say maybe the K will be Kazakhstan in 5 years' time. I don't know. But I'd like to know what these alternate spatial configurations mean. When you have regional politics, so Central Asian countries work with China and Russia in terms of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. If the Beijing consensus is philosophical, Beijing's SCO is even more of that ilk. But why you're doing it is because they don't know what the new development paradigm is. They're not saying we have an alternative. But they do know the one that was proffered at the end of the 20th century hasn't worked for them. And the one that they've got gave them 8% rate of growth. I'll stop there. Thank you.